Pirmiausiai norėjau pasakyti dėl mūsų anoniminių konkursų. Juos eilėraščius renka Rūta Dubauskaitė ir mes turim iki vakarienės jai pateikti tuos eilėraščius, nes juos reikia susekti ir pateikti vertinimo komisijai. O daugiau, aš manau, informaciją visą pasakiau. Taigi aš atiduodu į rankas Sauliui Vasiliauskui, moderatoriui, mūsų diskusijai vairą. Ir visų prašau, čia diskutuoja ne tik tie, kurie sėdi prie stalo. Čia diskutuot gali visi, bet kalbėt turim į mikrofoną. Tai jūs, tie, kurie nori pasisakyti, labai prašom ateiti prie stalo ir pasakyti, ką nori pasakyti, kad galėtų vertėjai išversti. Taigi, atrodo viską pasakyti. Dabar noriu suteikti dar prieš pradedant diskusiją žodį mūsų šio centro, kuris vadinasi valstybės ir savivaldybių tarnautojų mokymo ir reabilitacijos centras Dainava, direktoriai Zenonui Streikui.
Labą dieną visiems. Poetinis Druskininkų ruduo, manau, kad gamtos reiškiniu tampa, todėl, kad kaip paukščiai sučiulba pavasarį, kaip PDR nuskamba, Kornelijus pasirodo su taše, lapai krenta ir visą laiką susirenka virš 100 poečių ir poetų. Ir manau, kad labai džiugu, kad vis jaunėja, mes galvojom, kad, žinot, senstant kažkaip viskas išnyks šis reiškinys, bet kaip meksikiečiai sako, jie mus užkasė, nes nežinojo, kad mes sėklos. Užtat Poetinis Druskininkų ruduo kaip sėkla, nesvarbu kokia valdžia, kaip bandytų užkasti, ką nors atimti, bet vis tiek sudygsta ir klesti. Tai geros sėkmės, gražių eilėraščių, daug įvairiausių prizų ir gerų įspūdžių iš Druskininkų, iš Dainavos, iš šio renginio. Ačiū.
Tai labą dieną visiems. Šiandien susirinkome diskutuoti šio Poetinio Druskininkų rudens tema, kuris skamba taip: šiuolaikinė poezija, lokalūs, globalūs kontekstai. Ir prašau visus svečius, kurie dar yra čia kur nors, ateiti į priekį, susirasti savo vardus ir sėsti, prisijungti. Įžangą šitai diskusijai, šitai temai parašė poetas Gintaras Bleizgys, dėja jis negalėjo dalyvauti čia šiandien ir pasidalinti savo mintimis plačiau. tą įžangą jūs galite rasti kiekvienas šių metų albumete, jo pradžioje. Ir be kitų klausimų Gintaras ten formuluoja šiuos, cituoju. Dar egzistuoja tokių šalių literatūros, stilistikos, kurias galėtume pavadinti šiuolaikinės literatūros avanscena, literatūros ateitimi. Kokių šalių, kalbų, regionų, literatūros tradicijų ar literatūros mokyklų autorių kūryba dar didžiausia įtaka jūsų kūrybai, jūsų šalies literatūrai. Kaip dabartinė jūsų poezija atrodo regiono, pasaulio kontekste. Tai pats galvojau apie šią temą, man susidarė toks įspūdis, kad dažnai, galbūt ypač mažose šalyse, bet nebūtinai jose, labai žiūrime uždarai, taip efemeriškai tik į savo poezijos lauką ir nepabandome pažvelgti arba paremtai bandome pabandyti tą savo šalies poetų kūrybą, tą poetinį derlių, į jį pažvelgti, jį kažkaip analizuoti platesniame kontekste šiuo atveju vakarų Europos, pasaulio, žiūrėti, turiu galvoje ne tik kokiu nors pirmiausia, ne mokyklų ar srovių kokios nors įtakas, bet apskritai, sakykime, kai koks nors poetas ateina su nauja knyga ar naujas vardas į mūsų literatūrą, tai žinoma lemia labai mūsų kontekstas, ar jisai yra, ar jo kūryba nustebina, ar ji yra pasitinkama teigiamai. O štai galėtų būti, jeigu tą patį poetą perkeltume, čia hipotetiškai kalbų perkeltume į kitos šalies valdą, kad jisai ten būtų tiesiog vienodas ar panašus į kitus ir būtų nepastebėtas, liktų šešėlyje. Taigi kontekstas, kuriame poezija randasi, yra šio požiūriu labai svarbus. Viliuosi, kad čia atvykę ir pasisakantis, suprantama, negalintis aprėpti viso konteksto, pasidalinsantis fragmentų iš svečiais savo šalių literatūros patirčių ir galbūt pastebėjimų važinėjant, dalyvaujant renginiuose užsienyje. O mes, lietuvių poetai, pabandys pažvelgti ypač vertėjai, prašau įsijungti ypač vertėjai, nes jiems gal paprašiau, šiek tiek, žinoma, išmano savo kalbą verčiam poetų lauką. Tai galbūt pavyks tos fragmentus susėti į kokią tai visumą ir pabandyti atsakyti, ar dar verta kalbėti apie atskirų šalių kultūrą, poeziją kaip savitus reiškinius, ir vis dėlto jau kažkaip viskas universalėja ir tos ribos yra apstridusios. Tai dabar pirmąją kviesiu kalbėti poetę Liulietą Ješanaku iš Albanijos. Prašau pasidalinti savo mintimis šią temą.
It makes me, I lose the natural communication.
Please use your microphone.
And push the button.
So I became aware about the globalization a few years ago when I participated in an international event somewhere in Dubai, and I could see the English translation of each poet, and for a moment I really had difficulty to understand the background of the poets. I thought, who is the Arabic poet, who is the German poet, who is the Chinese poet? And it was like, what is going to happen? You exactly feel the effect, the impact of globalization in the world of poetry. I'm not talking about content only, because we are all victims of cultural stereotypes. Probably I would expect it to, let's say, to listen a story about a Bedouin in desert, from Arab poet. But I'm talking about the uniformity or, let's say, similarities according to the form, stylistic in general. And the thing is, in such moments we reflect, we think, what is going to happen, and where it comes from, and how we can avoid it. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Of course, you can't avoid this process. The thing is that we are all in touch with world literature, which means we are easily influenced by, let's say, the most last, fashion in poetry, the last publications in the world of poetry, and we can read everything in English. In this case, we can see the impact of culture of dominance, which is English culture, English American culture. Even the other writers from Europe, from the smaller languages, we can get them from English language. That's how that translation in English is very important for each poet in the world, I think. Now it's what exactly audiences, or especially foreign publishers, are waiting from us. You think that writing like that probably is a way which can make easy the literary communication. Is that true? Indeed, in one side we can't avoid that. On the other side, we are asking for something exotic, sensational from you. For example, still foreign publishers are interested to publish Eastern Europe literature, but the one which has to do with the period of communism. And because it's let's say, it's also something original, a kind of reality, a kind of history, let's say, the rest of the world doesn't know about. And the thing is that we, the writers from these countries, were almost kind of fed up by that, the past part. But we see that this is probably the only way how to, let's say, to offer something original and an interesting topic to the other audiences. It's true that the writing originates from your own very private room. But the thing is that you can't keep doors and windows closed, to the globalization on the one side. And the other side is that even our realities are changed a lot. So let's say during these 25 years, after the political and social changes, the living style in Albania and let's say this drama, human connections are not very different from, let's say, those in Italy or France or somewhere else. So we don't have only that exposure to the world, but we also reflect, the same, let's say, similarities of realities. Realities are not very different anymore. So that's why some writers, especially my generation, my country, used to focus on the historical past, because history is always the news, which can be, let's say, old part of history or communist history, something like that. Because it's being an isolated country or culture or ideological system, there is something still original on that. But for the moment, country, a post-communist country like my country, or country of transition, globalization makes us, makes our reality being like reality of everybody else. Nothing special, nothing original of that. And for a writer, it's very important, to create kind of a background, a special background, original background in their, let's say, piece of literature. And I myself, feeling that I was repeating myself, that I was consumed by my country history, my personal history, indeed I tried to take some fresh air. And on my last book, I wrote some portrait poems about Sicily. Indeed, I was inspired by the photos of an Italian photographer. And the thing is that after, I don't know if I succeed with these poems or not, but the thing is, after getting the book, people started to ask me, have you been in Sicily? Did you live there? Or the other one who asked me, okay, I'm very interested because my son-in-law is Sicilian. So you see that at the moment you pretend to play the global writer, indeed, you at the same time you can become, they don't trust you, you are not credible anymore, and almost ridiculous. So you can see that global is okay, but also there are some kind of limits of globalism. There's some kind of, let's say you can cross the borders, but you can't break the borders, or you can't challenge the borders. So I know that from my experience. And that's my personal experience and kind of my country experience. Probably.
So thank you. Marius.
Šiaip beklausydamas pagalvojau, kad mes dažnai būnam iš tikrųjų įdomus vakarams kaip savotiškos amžiaus Sovietijos aukos ir amžini nuskriaustieji. Kol tu esi nuskriaustas, kol tu esi įdomus. Ir iš to stereotipo, ir egzotiškas, ir iš to stereotipo yra labai sunku išsilaužti iš tikrųjų. Nes tu vis tiek kol kas esi vykęs tam traukos lauke ir tau labai sunku kažkaip būti suvokiama kaip, tarkim, bendros Europos. Aš nekalbu kaip labai jau globalizesnė prasme, bet tu vis tiek nešioji tą žymę kaip buvusio, tarkim, to rytų blokos Sovietų sąjungos narį. Ir vis tiek dar tave kažkur toliau suvokia kaip tokį žmogų, o ne kitokį.
Aš galėčiau pridurti prie Mariaus pasakymo, kaip vienas amerikiečių leidėjas kalbėjo su kitu apie mano poeziją ir tas kitas leidėjas pasakė, kad jam patinka grubi rytų europiečių metafizika.
Tai galvoju, kad jau į bendrą diskusiją išeisime kiek vėliau po visų norinčių pasisakyti. Ir dabar kviečiu prisijungti iš Estijos atvykusi Vaida Aprą ir pasidalinti savo žanginėmis mintimis.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought I'm probably a good example of globalism or whatnot, an Estonian poet with an Indian name. But always stems from my own interest in Indian culture, though. Anyway, I wasn't very sure what the discussion will be about, but I wrote something down for myself, and I won't read all of it, but I thought of reading a little bit of it, and then I'll say a few words upon it. Okay. We, people, human beings, we're all the same. Or are we? Since time immemorial, people have witnessed becomings and passings, have loved and cried, rejoiced and suffered. And for as long as they have remembered, they have kept on dreaming. No matter where we are in the world, we all try to make the best of today and hope and work for a better tomorrow. And yet, wherever we look, we see how old ancient traditions of the world have stemmed from the environment which they were born into. Inevitably, Arctic cultures have been different from those of the desert. Those of tropics different from those of temperate seasons, those of mountains different of those in the floodplains. Inland cultures different from the cultures of islands and so on. Why is it so if we're all the same? It seems to me that while we can certainly tag some universal human yearnings, the shape and very often the meaning they take depends heavily on the circumstance. Again, to celebrate solstice at the equator has no meaning. But not to celebrate in a place like, well, Lithuania means more or less to be out of sync with the cyclical rhythm of the nature here. It seems to me that we can really yearn for things that we have already experienced, or at least been able to envision. And for that we need an example, either human or natural. There may be a spirit inside us, but the ways of cultivating it cannot really be independent of the landscape. To understand the culture, we need to at least somewhat understand the environment, or also to understand a particular literature. I think we need to at least somewhat understand the surroundings of that literature, of the landscape or the environment. In fact, to deny a culture linked to the land is almost like a decry of its roots, a statement that essentially roots don't matter. We're all the same, we're global. But is that really globalism? Is it even openness? So, I thought that basically ways of defining globalism or seeing it. One would be that in a way we become more open to different cultures, different traditions, different literatures, poetry in the world. We learn more about it, and we also learn from it. But at the same time, I feel that often when people speak about globalism, I mean, maybe not among poets, but otherwise, it is more a description of a commercial strategy that, well, we want you all to use the same products wherever you are, because we're very global and very modern. And, well, of course it catches up, to an extent. I think we all do, I'm wearing a t-shirt from London, and, shoes which have been made in China or something. But, yeah. But at the same time, I try not to be so global that I forget where I'm coming from. And I feel if I try to be global, like I said, I have an Indian name, so as a writer, so if I want to translate Indian literature, I think it's really good to go there, at least once, and see where this literature and this poetry has come from. So I think that's the diversity. Globalism can be, it can further the diversity of poetry and culture that we are able to come in contact with. But on the other hand, globalism can be something which works the other way. It can, diminish this diversity by making us all more and more similar to each other. And one way out of it that I see is really to, in a way, stay connected to the place and to the land where you're coming from. Well, there's a few thoughts. Silence.
Many of it resonating and going to be accused of stealing from I found much of what you said really resonant with my situation, and I'll later be accused of stealing some of your points because I agree with lots of them, and I'll try and come up with different angles.
Well, it just happens to speak first. So.
Yes.
It's just as already stealing from you.
We're all stealing from here.
I can have a little example, just kind of a side note. I recently came in contact with a book which is called Three Greenland Poets, Three Poets from Greenland. And it was really fascinating reading. But the thing was, and it seemed very kind of authentic to me. I've never been to Greenland, but being a sort of northerner myself, I've been to the Arctic once. So they seem really stemming from this Arctic landscape. But after a little while I discovered that these three Greenland poets that are in the book, they don't exist. They are the inventions of the person who says he's the translator. And he had written biographies about three poets and so on. The story is very fascinating. And this made me think that, of course, there might be also cultures and traditions that are so different that when we come in contact with them as such, it's really hard to get them. They are so different that you don't really, also not only by the importance, but by the kind of shape of the tradition, that it's hard to understand them. So maybe we sometimes need these, or translators in inverted commas, so somebody to kind of bridge the gap between these cultures and where we are. I mean, just as a side note. Anyway, I think that's enough for me. Give the floor to others.
Thank you. And now, please speak Rimas Užgiris.
Lithuania. Aš iš karto atsiprašysiu lietuviams, kad aš parašiau savo pranešimą angliškai. It's going to be in English, don't worry. Yes. I'm apologizing. Čia ne mano kaltė, aišku, aš čia, žinai, esu priverstas visokius rūtus ir burokai priverčia mane versti į anglų kalbą ir aš negaunu praktikos rašyti lietuviškai. Tai ką aš galiu daryti? Tai rašau angliškai. Ir aš irgi akademikas, čia irgi ne mano kaltė, kažkaip pasidarė, tai aš paskaitysiu savo pranešimą. Po to galėsim kalbėti. Although the theme of this conference mentions global context for poetry, I would like to start by saying that I have no idea what a global context would be when it comes to literature. First of all, literature is written in language, and a work of literature is written in one language, maybe two, maybe one language with the addition of words and phrases from other languages. A language has meaning based on the context of its use, that is, for the population that actually speaks it in daily life. Thus, any work of literature must have a local context determined by a language. Furthermore, the meaning of a text flows not only from its language, but from another localized context, culture. We can separate a work of literature from culture no more than we can separate a human being, indeed the human being who wrote it, from culture. I am here sailing in parallel to the concept of culture articulated by Clifford Geertz. Quote, as interworked systems of construable signs, what ignoring provincial usages I would call symbols, culture is a context. A literary work is rooted in language and culture because human beings are. To use a more colorful metaphor that Geertz takes from Max Weber, quote, man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. I take culture to be those webs, and the analysis of it to be therefore not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. A poem is suspended in such webs of significance because language is one of those webs, and furthermore because the poet is also suspended. The idea of being suspended in a global web is meaningless because impossible. This does not mean, however, that every poem and every poet are completely local. Not only in today's, quote, globalized world, but in the past as well, poets have often been hung between webs. That is, the strands in which they are suspended are not univocal or unicultural. We can list off many such, I am sure. Oscar Miloš, the French poet from the Ukraine who became an ambassador for Lithuania, Rilke, who wrote in German and French, Brodsky, who wrote in Russian and English, and many more. But what interests me more are the poets who created singular works that reveal in their very construction the multiple webs of language and culture from which the poets hang. The poetry of Eduardo Corral, for example, enacts the author's existence as a Mexican-American by interweaving English language poems with Mexican Spanish and by creating a symbolic landscape that breathes of both Mexico and the United States. He was, of course, preceded by other Chicano poets, such as the U.S. poet laureate Juan Felipe Herrera. But probably the most world-renowned poet whose work enacts an intercultural suspension is Derek Walcott. His poetry is often infused with Caribbean, or St. Lucian, speech patterns, slang, and French Creole, all alternating with proper poetry in the Queen's English. He thereby enacts his suspension between cultural webs while interrogating his cultural identity. In The Schooner Flight, we find one of the strongest statements of the post-colonial human being's intercontextual nature. I'm quoting these 4 lines. I'm just a red nigger who loved the sea. I had a sound colonial education. I have Dutch nigger and English in me, and either I'm nobody or I'm a nation. These lines, spoken by Walcott's narrator Chabine, have been used as an epigraph by Junot Diaz in his novel The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, and for good reason. Both authors are concerned with the problem of where immigrants belong. When one is suspended between 2 different webs, sometimes equally, which one is home? Lithuanian poetry has done little to answer this question. Emigre poets have often had no doubt about where they belong. In the rolling fields and spruce forests of Lithuania, of course. Their poetry tends to reflect very little of the culture in which they live, usually the United States, and almost never allows the foreign language to enter the poetic discourse. The situation is a bit different in fiction, where we can think of Schema's White Shroud of the Global, or even Kunchenes's evocation of a polyglot multicultural Vilnius in Tula. Thomas Venclova, returning to poetry now, has recently written poems about the emigrant's life. For example, An Emigre, Emigrante, and The Dunes of Watermill, Copos Watermille. But the presence or intrusion of the foreign other is minimal in those works. I imagine the situation would be different if a Lithuanian emigrant began to write in the language of his adopted home. Charles Simic, for example, emigrated to the US as a teenager and wrote in English, becoming an American poet with only thin strands of a Yugoslav identity remaining. But this experience can be so dislocating that we can understand why so many of the Venclovas and Milošes refused. Their daily life may have been in English, but their poetry remained rooted in the place where they no longer were. Not so with Walcott and the Chicano poets. They have, like Chabine, gone to sea with no Ithaca to provide safe harbor. Likewise, their poetry floats between languages and cultures, not globally, for such a thing I maintain is not possible, but still interculturally. What solace they find in their wanderings over multiple webs comes from the beauty and hope of poetry itself. And here I'll quote some lines from Herrera's poem, Let Us Gather in a Flourishing Way. Let us gather in a flourishing way, with sun-loosed grains abriendo los cantos, where we toil siempre in the garden of our struggle and joy. Let us offer our hearts a saludar or águila rising, freedom, a celebrar, woven, brazos, branches, ramas. To breathe todos en el camino, blessing seeds, to give, to grow, maiztlán, en las manos de nuestro honor. Thank you for listening.
Gal kas nori reaguoti iš karto trumpai pranešimą? Reakcijos tuomet po to, dabar prašau dar prisijungti poetą ir eseistą Kornelijų Platelį.
Visa tau patinkanti poezija, kurią skaitai, o jo labiau verti, nugrimsta tavyje ir ten tūno, siųsdama nejuntamus signalus tavo emocijų ir mąstymo aparatui. Turbūt tai yra poetinis kontekstas. Kiekvieno kitoks, ne vieno iki galo nesuvoktas, nepasiduodantis jokioms analizėms, nesileidžiantis suvaromas į sąvoką. Žinoma, dar yra mūsų gyvenimiškos patirtis, neatskiriamos nuo tų poetinių ir dar uoliau dalyvaujančios mąstymo ir kūrybos procese. Ką apie visą tai galima pasakyti, o jo labiau diskutuoti. Kita vertus, pasakyti šitą turbūt galima atsigrįžus į savo lektūrą. Tačiau ar bus įdomu, jei kiekvienas dabar čia imsime deklaruoti savo perskaitytas knygas, nelyginant pajamas mokesčių inspekcijai. Mes prieš pietą buvom mokykloje ir kaip tik viena moksleivė tokio klausimo paklausė, kokios perskaitytos knygos padarė jums didžiausią įtaką. Aš manau, kad to nereikėtų. Bet kuris kritikas nesunkiai aprašytų vieno ar kito poeto kūrybos kontekstus, įvertinęs jo amžių, šiek tiek pasiskaitęs kūrybos ir peržvelgęs jo verstų autorių sąrašą. Tik ar kam nors tai rūpi. Visiems, bent jau įdėmiai jį skaitantiems, rūpi, ar tekstas yra savarankiškas poezijos kūrinys, ar tik konteksto reprezentacija. Kiekvienas mes kūrėm savo kontekstą, bet prisikasti iki jo nėra taip jau lengva. Prasikasti pro įvairias išorinės įtakas, pro mūsų žavinčius kitų autorių tekstus, bet kai tai pavyksta, mes galim sakyti, kad kūrėm, kaip Bleizgys sakė, savo lokaliniam kontekste. Žinoma, skaitytojo suvokimas irgi kontekstualus. Visada riboto diapazono, kad ir koks jis būtų platus. Bent jau man svarbu, ar tekstas teikia deramas prasmes, ar jis nuaustas laikantis pamatinių poetinės formos principų, ritmų ir pasikartojimų. Pasikartojimas taip pat generuoja ritmą, tik jau kitokį, didesnių segmentų, dažnai prasminių. Ritmą generuoja ir fonemų išdėstymas. Taigi, poeziją aš pirmiausiai suvokiu ir atskiriu ją nuo kitokio teksto, įvertinęs, ar šie du principai poetui yra svarbus, ar jis juos yra įvaldęs, ar jis juos naudoja savo kūrybai. Taigi, kontekstas, čia kalbu apie tą lokalų ir asmeninį kontekstą, o visa kita, ta, kaip sakoma, globalizacija ar kiti panašus dalykai. Aš manau, tam, kuris jau prisikasė iki savo konteksto, iš tikrųjų nėra svarbus ir jais neturi jokio pagrindo nei noro skųstis. Ačiū.
Dabar gal Erika pakalbės apie lietuviškus ir latviškus kontekstus ir apie kūrybą, kaip kūrė poetai ir poetės. Erika Draugytė, poetė ir vertėja iš latvių kalbos.
Sveiki, aš, kadangi kaip ir visi lietuviai gyvenantys iš tokių sudėtingų kultūrai situacijų, neturėjau laiko pasirašyti pranešimo, nes reikėjo rašyti projektus, tai aš pradėsiu savo kalbą nuo vieno eilėraščio, labai trumpo, kuris išverstas į lietuvių kalbą mano yra latvių antologijoje. Čia toks bus kaip intro, tik tai dėl to, kad suprastume, kaip mes vis tik tai savo tuos suvokimus galime koreguoti pagal laiko ir meto aktualijas ir kaip iš tiesų priimam realybę, kokiais žodžiais, kokiom savokom ir kokiom problemom esam persisunkę. Tai trumpas tas eilėraštis, aš skaitysiu lėtai. vyras, kuris gimė iš karvės kiaušialąstės ir jau buvo išmokęs kniaukti kaip katinas, vakar buvo suvyniotas į laikraštį ir išmestas lauk, kadangi tolesnis finansavimas projektui nebuvo paskirtas. Kaip būtų susiklostęs žmogaus gyvenimas, esant palankesniam biudžetui, sunku pasakyti. Tai taip ir gyvenam pagal biudžetus palankesnius ar dar kitus dalykus mūsų įspraudžiančius į tuos kontekstus. Ir dabar, kai Saulius bandė apibrėžti, kas tai galėtų būti lokalumas arba globalumas, apskritai galbūt reikėjo susitarti dėl to, kaip mes kokiam čia laukiai telpame, kalbėdami apie šitą klausimą. Tai mano galva lokalumas galėtų turėti dvi tokias pozicijas. Viena pozicija, kai yra verdama savo sultyse ir matomas tik tai tas šalia esančių kontekstas, nesigilinant į apskritai procesus bendražmogiškuosius. Ir toks pozityvus lokalumo suvokimas, kai tau jau pakanka ir lokalios erdvės, kai tu jau esi peržengęs tam tikrą savo paties brandos ribą. O globalumas galėtų būti ir kaip stacionarus toksai žvalgymasis po kitas erdves, kada tu domiesi kitų pasaulių kultūromis, mitais, kalbomis, rašytojų kūryba. Ir toksai, sakyčiau, labilus, realus keliavimas po kitas erdves, kada tau įdomu pačiupinėti, suprasti procesus, pačiupinėti žmones, matyti tas kitas erdves realiai, dalyvauti kažkokiose kūrybos namuose, žiūrėti, kaip kolegos dirba ir panašiai. Tai visos tos galimybės mums atsivėrė pakankamai neseniai, aš kalbu dabar apie lietuvių arba latvių kontekstą. Bet pradėsiu nuo to, mano galva, kiek negatyvaus lokalumo suvokimo apie tą virimą savo sultyse. Lietuvos ir Latvijos kontekstai šiuo klausimu kiek išsiskiria. Tiek, kiek man yra tekę bendrauti su Latvijos poetais ir būti tose bendruomenėse, tai vis tik tokių varžybų, aptarimų, kiečiausio paieškų, kas beje nesenoji istorija arba dar ir dabar vyksta lietuvių kontekste ir ypač vyrų pasaulyje, tai ten tikrai neteko su to susidurti. Ir man tas toksai gana primityvokas būdas rasti herojų savo kieme visada buvo šiek tiek juokingas ir naivus, kokie bebūtų nenaivūs, intelektualūs patys kūrėjai. Bet štai Latvijos kontekste ten bendruomenė jau seniau buvo atvira tokiai bendradarbiavimo dvasiai ir nei skirstymo pagal stilių ar srovę, nei pagal lytį, moteris ar vyras, nei pagal kietumą ar užimamą kažkokią tai ypatingą, įtakojančią vietą. Tokių dalykų man, gal tai subjektyvu, neteko matyti. Ir iki šiol labai gražus yra jų, Latvių, šitas bendravimo būdas, kada moterys ir vyrai, vyresni ir jaunesni kartos, mokytojai ir mokiniai, Jie mėgina rasti savo asmeninį lauką, kuriame išsiskleistų kiekvienas su savo žodžiu, su savo pasauliu, su savo kontekstais, lokaliais ir globaliais. Sujungdama lokalumą su tuo globalumu stacionariu, kada yra žvalgomasi po kitus pasaulius, aš galiu liudyti, kad globalumas yra lygiai toks pats atsivėrimas, kaip ir buvo tas daiktas, kai mums atidarė tą geležinį aptvarą. Kiek mes pajėgėme patys savyje atsiverti filosofijai, religijai, mus dominantiems dalykams, tiek mes ir galim į save įsiurbti daugiau, tiek kiek skirta, daugiau ir neįsiurbsi. Tiesa, kai mes išėjom iš Sovietų Sąjungos, buvo toks vienas mažas momentas, kada prasidėjo tos žvalgytuvės po kitas pasaulio valstybės ir noras tarsi toks atsirado sukurti universalų, gerą, teisingą eilėraščio sukūrimo modelį. Buvo be galo didžiulis noras padaryti eilėraštį tokį, kuris būtų lengvai verčiamas, lengvai suvokiamas ir kitų. Ir tokiu būdu tu turėjai šansą išsivaduoti iš tos, kaip sakė Marius, tik savo įdomios tarsi erdvės, gal tu kažkam neįdomus, bet dabar, jeigu tu pradėsi kalbėti taip, kaip visas pasaulis, panašiais terminais, panašiomis pasaulinės kultūros ar literatūros patirtimis, sukonstruosi eilėraštį, kurį lengvai išvers bet kuris vertėjas, tavo globalumo šansai padidėja ir tu išeini į tas erdves. Ir kaip bebūtų keista, šitas momentas jisai vyko ir Lietuvoje, ir Latvijoje, ir žmonės mėgino rasti tą universalų modelį tokio eilėraščio, tokios gana greitai suvokiamos poezijos. Tačiau joks modelis, kaip žinome, patys labai gerai nepadaro geros poezijos nei labiau lokale, nei labiau globale. Ir tai yra tik kiekvieno skaitytojo pasaulio kultūroms atsivėrimo jų kodams, ženklams, atsivėrimo unikalioms kiekvienos tautos patirtims, kalboms, kriterijus. Kriterijus yra skaitytojas, kuris priima, priėmėjas. Todėl iš tiesų negali būti neglobalios poezijos, nes jeigu mes kalbam apie medį, kokį jį bematytų suvokėjas, poetas, vis tik tą medį priims kiekviena tauta ir kiekvienas skaitytojas pagal save asmeniškai, pagal savo asmeninės patirtis. Ir vis tiek tai bus globalu. Tie jaunieji poetai maždaug 70-ųjų metų kartos, kuriais juos vadino prieš 20-metį, tada ieškojo savų staigių judesių, kad iššautų, kad taptų matomi, kad taptų globalūs. Ir tai buvo tikrai būdinga ir lietuviams, ir latviams. Bet dabar aš pati esu tos kartos ir kaip man gera stebėti, nurimusi šitą visą lauką, kada žmogus jaučiasi gerai savo erdvėje, kai jam nebereikia nieko įrodinėti ar parodyti, koks jis yra globalus, kai moterys rašo drąsiai eilėraščius apie moterų pasaulį, apie savo išgyvenimus, kai yra rašoma apie kaimą, apie giminę, apie kartas, ir tai yra daroma įdomia šiuolaikinė kalba, bet vis tiek tai yra nurimusio žmogaus kalbėjimas, kada jis nebijo būti apšauktas provincialiu ar lokaliu. Ir šitas kalbėjimas vis tik galų gale užvaldo skaitytojo širdį. Ir širdis vis tik ir yra svarbiausias lakmusas kuriuo mes ir matuojame poeziją. Tai tiek mano kalbėjimo, o pačiai pabaigai dar aš noriu paskaityti 2 eilutes iš mano mylimos poetės Lianos Langos, kuri labai daug laiko gyveno Amerikoje ir atvažiavusi buvo labai keista ir sunkiai priimama Latvijai, nes jos patirtis buvo visiškai kitokios, nesuvokiamos Latvijos skaitytojų ir tuo labiau net ir rašytojams vietiniams. Ji ten studijavo ir sapnų universitete tokiame ir patyrė įvairius dalykus. Tai bent jau jos poezijoje labai daug yra tų kontekstų įvairių ir vienas iš jų yra iš Emilės Dickinson. Tai leiskite dar paskaityti 3 eilutes iš eilėraščio ir kaip tai puikiai atspindi poezijos globalumą ir lokalumą. Tai paskutiniai rudens darbai, tu sakai. Paskui bus žiema. Paskui bus žiema. Vakare skaitysiu Emily Dickinson meilės ir mirties eilėraščius, kuriais jį pastojo nekalta ir nepakaltinama maniera.
Ačiū, Erika. Kažkaip kai skaito poeziją, tai tarsi norėtųsi ilgiau išlaikyti pauzę, kad mes čia kokį 10 minučių visi patilėtume. Būtų tikrai gražu, bet toks kitas formatas ir vis dėlto norisi, kad kuo daugiau žmonių išsakytų savo mintis ir norėčiau paprašyti viešnios iš Prancūzijos, poetės Aurelijos, pasidalinti savo mintimis.
Thank you. I took some notes while I was listening to my friends. So I will come with a very specific contribution to the reflection, which is maybe most one of the matters with which I have to deal with in my poetic experience, because I write in 2 languages. One is the state language, French, and one is minority language, Occitan. So, in few words, to let you know the situation of this language in France. We have many languages spoken in, many original and historical and regional languages in France. We have Breton, which is a Gaelic language. We have Occitan, Catalan and Corse, which are Romanic languages. We have Alsatian and the Basque, which is not even Indo-European. So this is a richness from the French territory. But this richness has always been denied and rejected. And French is the only language in which the word patois exists. There is no translation possible in foreign languages. Patois, this word appeared in the 17th century when the first dictionaries appeared with the creation of the French Academy. So it's a way to mean any language of France, which is not French. So it's a way not to recognize the status of language. And it drove people to funny situation, because someone in Bretagne would tell you, je parle patois. And someone in Occitania would say, je parle patois. And those languages have not any link in their roots. And so I will be brief, because I won't make a conference about it, but so this is how it works in France, and actually the Council of Europe established a document called La Charte, the Chart of Minority Languages of Europe. And France is the only country that didn't sign the chart because it's supposed to be in contradiction with the Article 2 of our Constitution, which means that we live in one country, one people, and one language, only one. So, it was a brief landscape. On the opposite side, in what we could call the Occitanist world, so the world of the militants, we face another problem, which is that they have tendency to treat everything that would come from France as something from the enemy. But this is ridiculous because we are all French. We all grew in French. It's finished the time people grew up speaking Occitan. So it's as if you were really fighting toward yourself. And they often create cultural events which are reinforcing the ghettoization of Occitan culture, because they will create cultural events where everything is in Occitan and everybody will speak Occitan, etc. And so if you don't speak the language, you feel not invited and welcome. And also something that happens because of the state politics towards the languages is that people integrated the shame. In Occitan we say vergogno, and the people have a huge shame of speaking that language. And indeed, it's in the south of France, so in the area where the language comes from, where I meet, where I face the most important reaction when I read my poems in that language. So what I mean is that even in the north of France, people welcome it. So as a writer, I don't write with a flag. I came to Occitan because it came to me when I had to write a poem. I chose that language because it was, I really grew up in that area, but I learned it when I was 12 or 13, so it's not my first language. And I chose it because it was not my mother language, because I felt more free to use this language as a poetic language, because I didn't grow up, I didn't go to school learning that language, so it was a kind of virgin language. I think that writing in such languages, so-called minority languages, about everything, about any topics, is the best way to give life to those languages, and much more than any kind of linguistic manifest. I never write about the language in my poems. Also, I experience when I go to some festivals, etc., people want to put words on you and on your situation. And I don't want to play the game of the victim, because we are not victim. I am advisor of a literary award in Italy dedicated to endangered and minority and lesser used languages. And here I meet people who had to leave their country, and people who really risk their lives because of their language, and often it's not only a question of language but also of ethnical differences and religious differences, etc. So, I mean, there is different level of, being a victim. So we say that the past helps to understand the present, but I think that also the present helps to understand the present, and that's where the global context is really pertinent. Thank you.
When I was overthinking about globalization, trying myself to explore each corner of this local context of globalization, I realized that first I have to make difference between global and universal, and it's the same way between personal and individual. It helped me to find out that poetry, at least, maybe it's justification, but to find it as a universal language more than global. Because the intention of globalization is, of course, to assimilate, as well as the greatest religions that included the pagan customs after they didn't succeed to destroy them. And we can see this tendency with when the globalization, in fact, not only that destroys, but they reconstruct the memory of space. Typical for this is, I don't know, maybe here you have this, but also in Macedonia, where I come from, a small country, those overnight buildings of so-called ethno-villages with materials made in China, for example, and so they could welcome the global people from around the world. And also, I found one aspect of globalization is very subtle, is renaming things, dealing with language. Language can kill, it proved in war in ex-Yugoslavia, if you pronounce, because languages were so similar, so the accent was crucial, whether to be killed or not, how the words were pronounced. And in that way, globalization tries to change, to names, to rename things. That's how language became matter, all of a sudden matter, very important matter of globalization, and we all think, and in a way we are connected at this high level of let's say, understanding through the imperfect English we speak, because that's our destiny at the moment, to understand at least each other, where we go, but not who we are. But I don't know, maybe for me, I turn back to silence very often as a kind of, let's say, universal language, kind of archetype of understanding, and I will try to these issues by reading some text to renaming silence, or let's say confronting the ideal republic of Plato and the global republic we live in. Try to read you something also. Everything I think that unites, it's the translation as a phenomenon. What Walter Benjamin said, that one of the most productive repeating. It's a very personal view, so I hope it's you will consider it as a personal, not as an egoistic. So, with each written word I depart in search of the lost silence. in search of the stillness that stays between the cry of the woman giving birth and the cry of the baby, between the uncertainty of the altar and the assuredness of the politician, between the prayers inside the temple and the questions at the temple's threshold. True and false prophets wrote their prophecies in verses, probably for the fear of the aching truth of the word. Behind the wall of security, poetry has made demystification of the great stories and distorted the hierarchy of official histories and defined nations. The difference between the ideal republic of Plato and today's global republic is that at those times the poet was removed from the sphere of social power, while today it is the poet who tries to remove the state from him. This is how the modern aesthetics of distance is being built. Each travel is connected with distance from the language of my childhood. What keeps me alive is the notion that poetry silently fights all the theories for the national or the historic predetermination. In poetry there is a still space to be conquered without killing. Contrary to this, since the time science marked each foot of the world map, human nature has started to cruelly tear down the palimpsests of current places and identities, to conquer the conquered, to make promises and to kill in the name of both those who are already dead and those who are yet to be born. The aim of each inviter is to first erase remembrance. Even parts of rivers are getting renamed. The same water flows from one to another name across the borders. This is the translating of identities at the same page of the atlas by renaming instead of replacing. Military commands are the most difficult to translate, for they are to be remembered by their loudness. They do kill without one knows their meaning. Should we trust the modified voices of poetry through the megaphones of power? Should poetry be the visible wind of the fluttering flags? In the nature, precious stones do not occur alone, while poets are considered as exclusive solitary beings, the key holders of their own fears and longings, someone says, of their own languages. In the past, they were considered to be the unconscious of emperors, then of peoples. They were being crowned when they wrote about eternities and identities grown into the flower pot of mass believing. Today, all of this is done by the media. Nevertheless, in some countries, you could still hear poets being greeted with "Long live poetry, long live the revolution." In 1941, the Russian papers placed on their covers the elegiac poem of Konstantin Simonov, "Wait for me," and the verses, "Wait for me, and I will come back, wait in patience," uttered as a prayer from the mouths of hundreds of thousands, mobilizes young Russians whose bodies served as an impassable border to fascism. Without the distance from the inherent awareness of belonging, poetry may remain merely a geopolitical reference which dwells in the myth of all-mightiness within defined administrative borders. I do believe in the evolution of frontiers and verses, in that transitory world of someone else's memories, in the archaeological presence of one's own unfinished mosaic. I struggle to find each word that will at least a bit get me closer to silence, to that essential absence, which is opposite of the absence of essence. I want to belong to the world because I don't want the world to belong to me. I don't have legs painted in my dreams or upon my cheeks. I long not to look out of the window when I write about escapes, not to withdraw a picture of the family album when I talk about maturity, not to become a soldier when I speak about war. With the fall of the Berlin Wall also fell stone blocks of the defined aesthetics. I became aware of the vulnerability of words and their livingness outside the compulsory textbooks. Roževič, in his poem Unknown Letter, tells how Jesus covered and forever wiped the letters he wrote with his fingers on the earth's surface when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John approached to him. Even he, who never even wrote anything, was aware of words' suggestive power. I do not have the illusion that I am saying something new, and I believe more in the hidden toys than to the war secrets. Sometimes, in order to write, it is necessary that one should stay in solitude, which does not bring fears and memories greater than death. The most certain way to remember your last dream is to not look through the window when you wake up. I'm a dissident of war refugees, and I take migrating not as a search for a better life, but as an urge for presence. Therefore, I do not know what could be better or worse. I'm able to say only what is further. I do believe that the urge of retelling will exist until there still exists the mystery of living and returning, the context of global and local, until sorrow remains a planetary state of being, sorrow that in conquered or colonized spaces is just an answer, but not weakness. Poetry is opening a new space of silence, and on the Balkans, people keep silent most often at the borders. Sometimes because of the fear of history, sometimes because of the admiration for the old cultural testaments. Susan Sontag, in The Aesthetics of Silence, lists artists and intellectuals that were determined to keep silent in a most unusual way. Rimbaud sets off to Abyssinia in order to get rich at the slaves' market. Wittgenstein first chose to serve as a sick attendant. Duchamp turned to chess. I often question myself, is translating just a way of being silent or a way to transfer the silence? Or perhaps the only way to travel silently through the homes and languages that don't belong to me, but to the world. Translation is live conversation with abundant words. They are animation into a new literary home of fragile identity. Reading in itself is translating. Translating in itself is writing. Writing in itself is abandoning the words. When someone passes away, we say that he leaves us, as if admitting that the one who is gone is the doer, is the one that does the act, while we are only alive observers full of fear from living. After so many wars and exterminations, the fear of being left has grown in me and developed an urge how to bury what I possess, instead of transferring to another place to become more global than local. Translation helped me to understand that transferring is also keeping, that it is leaving which precedes settling down and not vice versa. If criticism is a candle lit by another candle, then translation is the oxygen that keeps the light longer. Sometimes words lose themselves in the new language areas, like a child who, out of curiosity, loses itself along open doors. The wish for home, it is seeing the known images and hearing the already known meanings is what is multiplied both in translation and returning. Translation is a return of the words to silence and their rebirth into a louder environment. The lack of translators from Macedonian language forces me to speak English every time I show the passport, every time I cross the border of my inherited security, every time I try to be more global than universal. My native language thus remain only a language of my writing, away from any conserved identity. Both Miloš and Wittgenstein speak about language as homeland or city home, but in this case, poetry became the only universal home of the language.
Anybody wants to continue? It's really not an easy way to join now, but still I think maybe we can talk about the context also in a broader sense. I was wish to be. Noriu paklausti, gal kas nors nori įsijungti, čia turėtų būti iš tiesų diskusija, kad bet kada ir ne tik prie šito stalo, beklausant šitos poemos ir beklausant kitų pasisakiusių, kilo tokia įdomi mintis, kiek kontekstas dalyvauja poezijoje ne kaip literatūrinis kontekstas, o kiek, tarkim, dalyvauja poezijoje kažkokie kiti kontekstai, tokie kaip politiniai, mes čia girdėjome karo atgarsius, kiek įsiterpia kasdienybė, kiek įsiterpia pagaliau menas. Tarkim, aš esu iš vaizduojamųjų menų, tai šiuolaikinėme mene kontekstas yra labai svarbus. Kornelijus Platelis pasakė, kad vis tiek poezijoje eilėraštis yra svarbiausias tekstas. Tai šiuolaikinėme mene kažkuriuo metu, gal 90-aisiais, buvo netgi toks posakis, kai labai suklestėjo įvietinti menai, site-specific menai, kad būtent kontekstas, aplinka ir yra turinys. Context is the content. Tai tas įdomus dalykas, kad kiek aplinka įsiterpia į tekstą. Man būtų įdomu, jeigu poetai taip pat pasvarstytų ir visi čia esantis, kaip kažkokie kiti, nebūtinai literatūriniai kontekstai terpiasi į poeziją, kokiais būdais. Ar jūs, pavyzdžiui, ieškote santykių ar bandote išsireikšti kažkokiuose kitose erdvėse. Žiūrint į šiuolaikinį meną, tai ten galima pastebėti dabar savotišką poezijos atgimimą. Tai negali vadinti nebūtinai visą tai, kas užrašyta galerijos ant sienų yra poezija, tokia grynaja prasme, bet akivaizdus menininkų ilgesys parašytam žodžiui, parašytam tokiam ištartam žodžiui. Ir kai tas žodis užrašomas kažkoks sakinys, vienas sakinys neužvaizdas ant sienos, jis iš tikrųjų gauna daug jėgos, daug svarumo. Tai iš tikrųjų daug renginių dabar šiuolaikinė mene yra, taip ir skaitai. Tai vyksta kažkoksai forumas susijęs su poezija, tai šiuolaikiniai menininkai rašo eilėraščius. Ir man įdomu, ar yra kažkoks galbūt ir grįžtamasis ryšys, arba iš kitos pusės, pavyzdžiui, ar poetam irgi kyla noras kažkaip išreikšti save kitose srityse, piešti, apeliuoti kitus kontekstus ir kiek tas kontekstas, tarkim, neliteratūrinis kontekstas, gali būti produktyvus. Aš žinau, kad nemažai mūsų poetų fotografuoja. Yra galbūt kažkas, kas piešia. Žinau, Giedrė Kazlauskaitė visą laiką pasidalina ne tik tai savo įspūdžiais, bet dažnai ir eskizais. Tai galvoju, jeigu kas nors, kas norėtų tęsti diskusiją, galėtų dar pašnekėti apie juos dominančius kontekstus, tai irgi būtų įdomu. Ir labiausiai tai norėčiau dar mūsų svečius pakalbinti, nes turime retą progą, ne kiekvieną kartą atvažiuoja tiek daug poetų iš skirtingų šalių, va iš karto jau kiek kontekstų. Mes išgirdome ir apie kalbinį kontekstą Prancūzijoje, kas man buvo labai įdomu. Ir tas pasirinkimas rašyti, sąmoningai rašyti tą mažesnėją kalbą, kai visi tarsi norėtų rašyti tą didesnėją kalbą. Tai irgi toksai savotiškai ir literatūrinis ir politinis, sakyčiau, aktas. Tai man labai įdomu. Erika, man įsiūti.
Kalbėdama apie tą lokalumą bendravimo, sakykime, arba užsiskleidimo kažkokiose nedidelėse bendruomenėse ir tų herojų paieškų, aš negalėjau čia dabar išsiplėsti į kitą temą, bet kai aš bendrauju su savo moksleiviais mokykloje, tai mano pagrindinis uždavinys, kurį aš savo pati esu išsikėlusi, tai aš jiems visada kartoju, aš norėčiau jūs išmokyti integruoto mąstymo. Nes iš tiesų dalykai mokykloje yra labai dėja, nors mūsų švietimo programa daugybę metų kalba apie integruotą mokymą, dėja nėra tokia. Ir tik pavieniai mokytojai arba pavieniai kažkokie žmonės mėgina tą daryti. Tai ir mūsų visuomenėje tai labai gerai atsispindi. Tie, kurie savyje mėgina atrasti tos kontekstus, yra iš tikrųjų integruotos visuomenės dalis. Ir aš pažįstu daugybę žmonių, kurie eina į dailės parodas ir bendrauja asmeniškai su dailininkais. Ir tie meno kontekstai tada atsispindi be abejo kūryboje arba šiaip buityje net ir visame bendravimo lauke. Muzika, teatras. Aš net neįsivaizduoju, ar įmanoma sukurti poeziją be konteksto ir kitų dalykų. Ar įmanoma neprisilietus prie viso lauko bet kokio, ne tik kalbinio, ne tik kultūrinio apskritai, ką mes suprantame kaip kultūrą, bet ir labai atskirų konkrečių sferų, kurios veikia lygiai taip pat visuomenę savo indėliu, savo socialiniais pareiškimais, savo, sakykime, eksponavimusi netgi. Bet galbūt globalios visuomenės vienas iš tų pozityvių bruožų ir būtų tas intertekstualumas ir gebėjimas komunikuoti įvairiais principais su įvairia pažinimo patirtimi, įvairių kontekstų pažinimo patirtimi, ne tik praeities, ko mes galime pasigirti ten, kad pažįstame dailės istoriją, bet ne, šiandieną, čia ir dabar vykstančiais procesais. Ir manau, kad kaip dailė arba fotografija įtakoja struktūras ir poezijos kitimo ir atvirkščiai muzika ar kažkas gali labai puikiai įtakoti ir dailės kūrinio struktūrą ar kažkokius dalykus, tai šitos komunikacijos vyksta nuolatos, galbūt kai kurie to nepastebi arba yra užsisklendę, arba tada jau yra kita problema atsiranda, susvetimėjimo problema, kada mes užsidarome savo lauke su savais ir netenkame tos komunikacijos lauko plataus.
Your question about the other kind of art. I think that poetry is to literature what philosophy is to human sciences. Philosophy talks about history, about sociology, psychology, etc. I really think that poetry is done in itself to be in dialogue with the other forms of art. And in its origins, poetry, song, and theater were not distinguished. So I don't have the luck to be also a painter or a musician or a dancer, but as a poet I really work to create this dialogue, so that's my personal way to deal with all the form of arts and to give to poetry this dimension that she has by nature. And I cannot give it by my own self alone, but that's great also because it gives, it's writing, it's an experience of loneliness. You write alone, and even it's a bit egoist because you cannot share that time with the people you love. So this dimension is also a way to share creation, to share. So
I will say a quick thought. It's more about different languages inside the poem, not about collaboration with different art. core of what makes it alive. And it's always our mental being. And I thought that there is all of us are restless, and this kind of uncomfortable position, permanent uncomfortable position, makes you go out and go in. What I mean is that when I grew up in a small place, I always felt that there is the language of the empire, the language of the center, which in the beginning was Tel Aviv, and then it's outside in the big world. And this unrest place inside of being connected to the higher language, to the bigger language, to the controlled language, to the powerful language, makes you always go out of yourself. And then, in some point, you feel the desire to go back to the intimate language. You get tired or you get frustrated by the empire language, let's say, and you become restless again, because this is how we build. And you go back to the intimate language, or the personal language, or to the small village language. And then I thought about it, if I take this kind of model inside to literature life, I thought that the poets I like are the poets that have the combination within the poem between the personal being and the universal approach. Like you talked about Derek Walcott, or Milosz was mentioned, or Robert Lloyd that we talked about in the way here. All of them are, all of their poetry, I guess, is a struggle between being very personal and being universal, and moving between these languages. And I feel this is, for me, this is the right way of poetry, and also the importance of giving the public or the people this feeling that you can move between languages, because I feel people sometimes get trapped in their desire to be isolated, or in their desire to be a part of the bigger language. And they can't go out of this double desire, let's say. And I feel that good poetry gives them the example of moving between languages. And even if I do it in a higher level, and I think about the conflict in the country I come from, you can't come from Israel and not talk about the conflict in the conference, no? It's not appropriate. Why they brought me here? So if you think about the conflict, it's the same way. We don't have a double language. We don't have the language of the private human being and then the country or the ideology or the history. And I feel that poetry, and this is why we talked about how important poetry is inside my culture and the culture that is neighbor to us, is the way that poetry shows you that you can move between languages. You don't need to lose a language in order to gain a language. You can just move from one to another within the 10 or 15 lines of the poem. That's it.
I wanted to expand on and unpack some things that just been mentioned en passant. When we speak of globalism, we also speak of things like such felicitous things as diaspora, decimation, and genocide. And globalism arguably began with Columbus' discovery of the New World. And Isabel expelling the Moors and the Jews from Spain. And to touch on globalism, I grew up in what William Burroughs would call the interzone. I grew up on the border of Mexico, of the capital of Baja California, which was a city of about nearly 500,000 people. Next to it was Calexico, a city of 15,000 people. It was an open port. It was a free port. So as a child, there's something that's called Warner Brothers 7 Arts, that's very pretentious, but you can argue that cinema takes aspects of poetry. And as a child, I would go see trashy Hollywood movies, but I would also go into Mexico and I'd see something like Fellini's La Dolce Vita with Spanish subtitles. Or they'd drag out the perennial Cocteau, Beauty and the Beast, dubbed into Spanish. Or Warner Brother or Walt Disney cartoons, or Hitchcock movie, you haven't lived until you've seen Psycho badly dubbed into Spanish. But the thing is that the language I was exposed to, Spanish was my first language, a very long and complicated thing to that. But as a child, I was exposed to Shakespeare and to the prose poets, the hunters of metaphor who primarily worked in prose, and who, they were post-colonial before people were talking about post-colonial. Someone like Joseph Conrad, who originally spoke Polish and wrote in English. James Joyce, who hijacked the English language. Continuing with people like Derek Walcott, Toni Morrison, Salmon motherfucking Rushdie, people like that, who've really just opened up globalism, opened up the whole can of worms. Gunter Grass, magical realist Gunter Grass. And also as a kid I read Carlos Fuentes and Borges, just as they were about to become really big. But it was just interesting seeing all this stuff, and then when people were starting to talk about globalism, I turned to my Mexican-Russian friends or my Dutch-Mexican friends. I'm Irish-Mexican myself. Or my Jewish-Mexican friends, Latinos, or my friends from Pakistan and India who hated each other's guts because they spoke the same language, to expand on an earlier point. Or my Serbian and Croatian friends who also hated each other's guts because they spoke the same language. And when this whole globalism thing started to come up, we'd say, what? They're just noticing it now. And of course, post-colonialism and post-Marxism, we're in the post-age, and I think that some people will say that globalism right now is having an end game because of the various backlashes, and I refuse to discuss Trump. But I just think it's entering another phase. And everyone has spoken very eloquently about the different strategies and approaches that we have to take, because it is a very complex landscape and it does have to be negotiated. And I'm just going to leave it at that. I didn't even organize or take any notes. But that's all I wanted to say at this point. Sorry for sometimes you have to go a very long distance out of your way in order to come back a short distance directly. Edward Alley said that, and he died recently. So that's it.
Aš labai trumpai norėjau atsiremti į poezijos reikiamybę būti ir turėti sąsajas su kitais menais ir liudyti poezijos ir teatro džiaugsmą, nes, pavyzdžiui, vaidini spektakliuose, režisieriai režisuoja, pilna geros dramaturgijos, bet kodėl norisi statyti režisieriams, dalyvauti poezijos spektakliuose, vaidinti poeziją ir ne tik su muzika ir dailės tam tikroje kone, bet netgi per teatro metaforas, teatro kalba, vaidinti, kalbėti, išreikšti poeziją. Tai aš noriu pasidžiaugti tuo, nes man labai nemažą laiko tai tenka daryti ir tuo pačiu dar ir noriu pasakyti, kodėl aš vis būnu čia. Todėl, kad ir pasisemti literatūros, ir šitos konferencijos, ir pokalbiai, jie duoda peno tau kaip žmogui, kaip menininkui, bet ir žiūrėkite, kokios būdavo temos, oras, vanduo, žemė ir tu vaidindama kokią nors žemę ar baseine plaukiodama laiveliu deklamuoti išsisukus plačiai vakarų vilnimis. Tai yra tam tikras, taip toks, ir džiaugsmas, ir transformacija visai į kitas sferas. Tai labai literatūra reikalinga visam kam, ne tik tai skaitimui, bet ir vaidinimui, ir ištarmei tikrai. Ačiū.
I guess I'll make a final comment about translation before we finish in globalization. I want to continue my skepticism of this whole globalization thing in literature. As a translator, I don't translate from Lithuanian into some kind of universal global English. My choice is always between, Lithuanian culture and my English, which is Northeast American English, and my local references. In my classes at the university, when my students translate into English, sometimes they write something and I say, well, that's either wrong or it's just British. And I don't know. See, that's the point, is I don't know what the British would say. I don't know what the Irish would say, right? The English is different, and especially in literature, it really makes a difference, right? There's very subtle differences, cultural references, and my choice is always, how much Lithuanian do I preserve in my translation, how much of the Lithuanian culture, and how much do I domesticate. One quick last example is from the PDR anthology 2 years ago. I translated a poem by Ramune Brunzaitė about dogs, little dogs go to heaven, something like that. And she had a reference in there to Brisos Galas, a very famous short story that every Lithuanian knows from high school about a dog who's killed by its owner. And what do you do as a translator? If you put in Brisos Galas, no one will know what it means. So then you can put in a footnote, but Druskininkė doesn't use footnotes. Now, I decided to change it, domesticate it. Now, I didn't domesticate it to what I thought was universal, but to my own experience as a child. I watched a movie called Old Yeller, in which the owner shoots a dog who's a hero. And so I changed it so that people would get the emotional impact. But I only did that because I knew on the facing page there would be Ramune's poem in Lithuanian, and people could look and say, is she talking about Old Yeller or Brisos Galas? And they would see that it's different and that I changed it. So in that sense, I felt, okay, I preserved, they were able to see that the translator had inserted something. But even my insertion was not global in my view. It was still my locality, right? my culture. And that, I think, is the ethical struggle of the translators, is how much to preserve of the original culture versus how much to change to make it easier for the people to read it in your target culture. Thank you.
Does anybody want to...
May I add something?
Yes, please.
Many of the things I wanted to say or thought of saying today have already been said better by my distinguished colleagues, so I'll be brief. I wanted to come back to what Marius was talking about at the very beginning, with reference specifically to the view of Lithuanian and Eastern European poets in the West, because it's an area in which I work and in which I feel I have a kind of mission. I write in English, which is supposedly a global language, but in fact I have the daily experience of how provincial American readers and publishers are, and I try to do what I can to persuade publishers, editors, and so on to take an interest in literatures they are very ignorant about and feel ashamed of being ignorant about, and so it's a complicated dance that we do. But one thing I think is a hopeful sign is that in my generation I see a real change. Just as in Eastern Europe, poets of my generation are tired of being victim poets, poets of historical tragedy, and so on. while not denying their own history, want to be human poets, want to be fully human as poets, and not read as symbolic of some history. I think the translators, poets and translators, poets who learn languages and translate poetry of my generation have different tastes, so that they will know their Miłosz and their Kish and their Venclova, but they will also have an interest in what they share with Eastern European poets. I mean, there's a certain kind of conversation that I can only have, in fact, with a poet in Warsaw, because we understand, we both love each other's grandparents. You know, they love John Ashbery and Frank O'Hara, whom I can't stand, and I love Herbert and Różewicz, and we can have interesting conversations about this, and about, you know, how to get on from that point. So I don't know what all this has to do with globalism. I mean, I think there's no more anti-poetic word than globalism, frankly. It just kind of paralyzes my mind. And the image that it conjures up for me is Charlie Chaplin in The Dictator, you know, as with a Hitler mustache, you know, twirling a globe. I think it's used by publishers and obviously by PR people. As Matura was saying, it's a marketing word used because people are now uncomfortable about using the word universal, because it's politically incorrect to talk about what's universal. It makes people very uncomfortable. So maybe it would be interesting at some point to have a debate about what is universal, because that's a question that is never answered, but is, to me, eternally interesting. And what globalism is, seems to me, I mean, I believe in global warming. That's pretty much the only globalism that I believe in. And I think poets, in a sense, have to represent a kind of thinking which by definition is not global, but may try to be universal.
Does anybody want to join or to comment? Because it seems that our time is running out, and I would really like to thank everybody for your thoughts and your poems and your questions. Norėčiau visiems padėkoti, visiems, kurie pasisakė, kurie kartu sėdėjo, mąstė. Ir tikiu, kad dalinsis toliau savo mintimis ir klausimais. Ir kartu norėčiau pakviesti dabar čia pat iš karto šioje salėje įvykstančios parodos atidarymą ir galbūt jos autorius Raimundas Kardulis tartų keletą žodžių. And soon there will be an opening of the exhibition just around the corner, here in the next hall, and I would like the author to say a few words. Raimundas Kardulis.
Volaidžio vanduo vertėsi volais nuo kalno, žodžiai plaukė Nemunu. Čia ne Florencija, todėl meno šedevrai Nemune nenuskrendo. Viena kita knyga, senas kalendorius įnirko. Paskui išdžiūvo, skaitymui netiko, bet prapulos kaip tik. Kaimynų albume atsitiktinai rasta atvirutė su 1958 metų Nemuno potvynio vaizdu vėl atgyja. Persipina su pavartimi, kuri yra kas? Stalinistinis silikatinių plytų namas, čia gyveno žmonės, ar Muravjovo laikus menantis reikšmingas dabarčiai statinys, ar 16 amžiaus universiteto bokštai, o gal ši diena, tai yra sąlyginė dabartis, yra Lenkų laikais kurorte iškilusi vila. Stiklinis daugiaaukštis sostinėje ir sukiužusios sodybos griuvėsiai. Tos pačios, kurios Nemunas neįveikė prieš beveik 6 dešimtmečius. Juk tai irgi dabartis. Dalykai, reiškiniai, kurie buvo sutvarkyti, paleisti, pamiršti, vėl iškyla, išlenda, pasikartoja, nusispalvina, vaizdai žaidžia su tikrove, nardydami dešimtmečius. Pagalvojau, kad fotoparoda Atvirutė kišenėje yra tarsi klevo lapų pamestas sauja Druskininkų gatvėje, bet šis rytas pakoregavo tą dalyką, nes nubudau 6:14 ir galvoju, jauną metį už lango. Važiuoju pro langą, žiūriu tas personažas, Karsonas, kuris gyvena ant stogo su propeleriu gatvėje. Bet jis neskrenda. Tai buvo žmogus, aš nežinau su kokiu įrenginiu, klevų lapus pučiantis mieste. Anksčiau miestuose žmonės žadindavo trimitais arba varpais, o druskininkai žadinami 6:14 lapų nupūtėjo garsais. Ačiū Jums tiek. Čia bus tokių atviručių, Jūs pasiimkite nuo stalo. Viskas, ačiū.
Tai prašom į parodą ir susitinkame ten.
Ir labai ačiū vertėjams.